You wake up one day and realize that something is terribly wrong with the world. Not in the way the news says, not in politics or the economy, but in a way you can't quite name. You're standing in your kitchen, coffee in hand, and suddenly everything feels paper thin. Your job, your plans, even your own reflection in the window. It's as if you've been living in a story someone else wrote for you, and the ink is starting to fade. At first, you think it's exhaustion. Maybe you've been working too hard, scrolling too long, dreaming too small. But the feeling doesn't leave. It follows you into meetings, into conversations, into the quiet moments before sleep. The laughter of friends sounds rehearsed. The news anchor looks like an actor. Even your own voice feels borrowed. You start to sense it. This world, this rhythm, this constant performance, it's not what it seems. No one tells you that awakening isn't beautiful. It's violent. It's the quiet demolition of everything you thought was real. You don't float into light. You fall through illusion. You lose your appetite for the game, the endless chase for recognition, validation, identity. You see people playing their roles, clinging to masks that no longer fit, and you want to scream, but you don't. Because you understand now, they can't see what you see. Not yet. You'll try to go back. You'll pretend to care about the small talk, the titles, the future plans, but something inside you has snapped. The curtain's been pulled back, and you can't make yourself believe in the show anymore. You can't unsee the emptiness behind the applause. So you sit there, coffee turning cold, heart pounding with a strange mix of grief and freedom. You whisper to yourself, something's ending. But deep down, you know, it's not the world that's ending. It's you. The version of you that believed the dream was real. The one that thought there was somewhere to arrive, someone to become. That one is dying. And something else, something vast and silent, is beginning to wake. The trance begins long before we realize we're in it. It starts in childhood with soft voices telling us who we should be. Be polite, be productive, be successful. Every word is a thread. And by the time we grow up, those threads have woven a net so tight we call it life. We don't question it because everyone else is trapped in the same design. We wake up, drink the same coffee, drive the same highways, wear the same tired smiles. We call it freedom, but it's choreography, steps memorized so well we mistake them for choice. Alex didn't know when the trance took hold. Maybe it was the day he got his first promotion, or the moment his father said he was proud. Somewhere between the applause and the deadlines, he stopped living and started performing. Each morning became a rehearsal, suit, smile, silence. He laughed when others laughed, nodded when others spoke, and measured his worth by the reflection of their approval. Yet beneath the laughter, something hollow echoed. He could feel the falseness spreading through the air, like static before a storm. America taught him that life was a climb, degrees, paychecks, square footage, but no one mentioned the emptiness at the top. At 38, he had everything his younger self wanted and nothing his soul could hold. The house felt like a showroom, not a home. The conversations were polished but soulless, people competing over whose exhaustion sounded more impressive. He caught himself smiling through it all, terrified that if he stopped, the silence would expose how lost he really was. There's a strange comfort in pretending. The trance is not cruel, it's safe. It promises that meaning lies just one achievement away, but it's a lie that grows heavier the longer you carry it. Alex began to notice small things first, how people praised busyness as if it were holiness, how every moment was filled with noise to avoid hearing the truth. Even happiness had become performance. Smiles were traded like currency. Gratitude was filtered for social proof. The world was no longer living. It was advertising. One evening, as he sat in traffic, the city glowing red from brake lights, something in him snapped. The cars moved like a river of ghosts, everyone alone together, staring at glowing rectangles. He thought of all the hours he'd traded for things that never filled him, and a quiet voice whispered, "This can't be what life is." That whisper was the crack. The dream wavered. For the first time, he didn't turn on the radio. He didn't scroll his phone. He just sat in the silence, feeling the hum of engines, the weight of stillness pressing against the glass. He realized that this silence wasn't emptiness. It was the first sound of something real. The trance had begun to loosen, but he didn't know what waited beyond it. Only that he could no longer believe in the story everyone else was still acting out. And as the traffic lights changed, painting his face red, yellow, then green, he stayed still. Because deep down, he knew. Once you start to see through the dream, you can never go back to sleep. When the illusion begins to crack, it doesn't shatter all at once. It fractures quietly, like ice underfoot, each step forward echoing a sound you can't unhear. For Alex, that sound followed him everywhere. The meetings, the laughter, the dinners, all of it carried a faint tremor of unreality. He used to move through the world with confidence, fitting neatly into its rhythm. But now every room felt slightly offbeat, every conversation just a half second out of sync. The world hadn't changed, but his eyes had. And once you see, you can't unsee. He tried to ignore it at first. He forced himself to smile at parties, to laugh at the jokes, to nod at stories about vacations and promotions, but it felt like watching a play from the audience after spending years believing you were one of the actors. The gestures were the same, but the meaning had drained away. He could see the subtle competition in every exchange, the hunger for validation hidden beneath polite words. Even kindness, he noticed, often came with conditions. Compliments designed to be reciprocated, sympathy that wanted to be seen. And once that awareness took root, every moment of connection began to unravel. The most painful part wasn't the falseness around him. It was realizing how deeply he'd participated in it. He remembered all the times he'd laughed too loudly, agreed too easily, shaped his opinions to match the room. Not because he was dishonest, but because he was afraid of disappearing. The game had offered safety. It gave him a name, a face, a role to play. Now that safety was gone, and in its place was something colder and far more honest: solitude. The loneliness of awakening isn't the absence of people. It's the absence of illusion. When you stop pretending, you find yourself surrounded by actors who still believe in their lines. You want to reach out and shake them, to tell them the play isn't real. But you also remember how comforting the script once was, how unbearable it felt to stand without one. So instead, you fall silent. You sit among them, listening to the hum of conversation, and you feel both near and impossibly far. Alex began to notice how little people truly heard one another. Words were exchanged like currency, each person waiting for their turn to speak, not to understand. He saw how much of human interaction was built on fear: fear of being unseen, unloved, irrelevant. He had that same fear once, but now, stripped of the story that used to define him, he had nothing left to protect. The loss was devastating, but it was also freeing. Sometimes he would walk through the city late at night when the streets were empty and the world felt bare. The silence didn't frighten him anymore. It felt pure, unfiltered by performance. He realized that seeing the truth didn't make him superior. It made him tender. He could no longer hate others for their blindness because he could see the pain that kept their eyes closed. That was the hidden cost of clarity. You lose your right to despise. You understand too much. He missed belonging, but not enough to go back. You can't unlearn authenticity. You can't unknow the taste of truth. He found himself craving solitude, not out of bitterness, but because it was the only place left that felt real. The noise of the world still surrounded him, but inside, a different silence began to grow, one that wasn't lonely, only vast. In that stillness, he began to sense something forming, a faint pulse beneath the emptiness, like the quiet rhythm of life itself. He didn't know it yet, but the loneliness of clarity was only the threshold. Beyond it waited something deeper than belonging, something larger than self. But to reach it, he would have to let the last illusion die, the illusion that there was still a him left to lose. The self doesn't die with violence. It fades like fog when the sun rises. At first, you don't even notice it slipping away. It's subtle, a missed reaction, a forgotten defense, a moment where you realize the voice in your head is no longer sure who it's talking to. For Alex, it began one morning when he looked in the mirror and didn't quite recognize the man staring back. Not because his face had changed, but because the story attached to it no longer fit. The name, the career, the personality, all the labels he had worn like armor, suddenly felt like old clothes that no longer belonged to him. He smiled, but the reflection didn't smile back. It just watched, silent and uninvested, as though waiting for him to understand. The unraveling came slowly. He had built his life like everyone else, with effort, ambition, and belief in continuity. You are this kind of person. You like these things. You stand for this. The mind loves the idea of a fixed self because it gives chaos a name. But as Alex's awareness deepened, that certainty began to erode. He noticed how easily his moods changed, how his beliefs shifted depending on who he was with. Around his colleagues, he was decisive. Around his mother, gentle. Around strangers, reserved. Each version of himself felt real in the moment, yet none endured. The question rose like a tide. If he could change this completely depending on the circumstance, then what exactly was he protecting all this time? He searched for solid ground within himself and found none. His memories no longer defined him. They were only echoes of different versions, each clinging to the illusion of permanence. The stories he used to tell about his life, his victories, his traumas, his turning points, sounded distant, like a novel he'd once read and half forgotten. He began to suspect that Alex was not a person, but a pattern, a set of habits, preferences, and fears orbiting around a center that didn't exist. The realization terrified him. Without a story, who are you? Without identity, who lives your life? The ego fights hardest right before it dies. His mind rebelled, desperate to reclaim itself. It reminded him of his responsibilities, his past, his ambitions, proof that he was still real. But the more he tried to grasp them, the more they dissolved. Every thought of I felt hollow, like speaking into a canyon and hearing only an echo. It was disorienting, almost unbearable to feel himself dissolving in plain sight. And yet, beneath the fear, there was also relief. The effort to be someone had exhausted him for decades. Now that effort was falling away. What remained was presence, raw, unfiltered awareness without a mask. He noticed the mind's tricks more clearly now, how it created a self out of memory and projected it into the future to maintain continuity. But continuity was just comfort, not truth. Truth was movement, fluid, unpredictable, alive. He realized he wasn't a fixed entity moving through time. He was time itself, flowing, moment to moment, never the same. The self was never a being. It was a process pretending to be solid. Once that pretense collapsed, there was no one left to defend. For days, Alex drifted between terror and calm. He felt both nowhere and everywhere, unanchored but strangely free. The world appeared sharper, colors more vivid, sounds more alive. Without the filter of identity, everything shimmered with immediacy. The old self had died quietly without Vast had taken its place. Not a new me, but something prior to it, something that couldn't be named. He didn't know what to call it, only that it wasn't a person at all. It was life itself, looking through his eyes. And though a part of him still mourned what was lost, another part, the one that could finally see, knew that nothing real had died, only the story had. And when a story ends, truth finally has room to begin. There is a moment when everything falls silent, not because the world stops making noise, but because the noise no longer owns you. After the collapse of his story, Alex found himself drifting through days that felt weightless. His old ambitions had dissolved, his fears had lost their shape, and even his thoughts seemed to pass through him rather than belong to him. At first, this silence was unsettling. The mind, once so full of movement, now had nowhere to go. Without the constant narration of self, existence felt strangely vast, too vast. He tried to fill it, to think his way back into something familiar, but nothing stayed. Every thought, every emotion, every identity that rose up vanished before it could settle. And slowly, he stopped resisting. One night, unable to sleep, he left his apartment and began to drive. The highway stretched open and empty, the city lights fading behind him. The air was cool, carrying the faint smell of rain, and for the first time in a long while, there was no destination in his mind. He drove simply to move. As the miles passed, something inside him softened. The hum of the tires, the rhythm of the wind, it all began to blend together until it felt as if the car, the road, and the man were not separate things at all, but a single movement. The illusion of control slipped away. He wasn't driving anymore. Life was. When dawn began to break over the horizon, he pulled off the road and stepped out. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, silent and golden under the first light. He stood there, barefoot in the sand, and the realization came, not as a thought, but as a recognition. There was no Alex standing there. There was only awareness, quietly watching itself. The stillness beneath everything was not something he reached for. It was what had been waiting underneath his reaching all along. For so long, he had believed freedom meant choice, the power to shape, decide, and control. But standing there, he saw how wrong that belief had been. True freedom wasn't found in mastery over life, but in surrender to it. The self that wanted to control was the same self that suffered. When that self dissolved, what remained wasn't chaos, it was peace. Not the peace of achievement or escape, but the peace of nothing left to defend. He sat down on the sand, watching the sky shift through shades of rose and gold. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It pulsed with something vast, alive, and unspeakably gentle. Every sound, the breeze, a distant bird, the whisper of his own breath, felt like a note in the same eternal song. Time lost its grip. The past and future no longer mattered because everything that could ever exist was already here, unfolding in this one unbroken moment. He felt tears rise, not from sadness, but from recognition. The search had never been for meaning, love, or enlightenment. It had always been for this, the simple, unadorned awareness that had never left him, not for a single heartbeat. It was what had been seeing through his eyes when he was a child, what had listened through every silence, what had remained when every illusion burned away. It was him, and yet not him at all. As the sun climbed higher, he began to understand why awakening is called seeing. It isn't about gaining new sight. It's about finally looking without the distortion of desire and fear. The world hadn't changed, but its texture had. The ordinary shimmered with quiet divinity. The grain of the sand, the trembling of light on metal, even the ache in his chest. Everything was whole. He sat there for hours, not waiting for revelation, because revelation had already happened in the absence of expectation. What he once called himself was now a transparent window through which life moved freely. He knew he couldn't hold on to this awareness. Trying to keep it would only make it vanish, but he no longer needed to. The seeing itself was enough. And in that vast stillness beneath the noise, for the first time, he felt completely alive. When Alex returned to the city, the world appeared unchanged. The streets were still loud, the faces hurried, the routines predictable, yet something invisible had shifted. The silence that once terrified him now followed him like an old friend. The same noises that used to overwhelm him, the hum of traffic, the chatter in cafes, the clicking of keyboards, no longer intruded. They seemed to move through him, harmless and transient. He had thought awakening would make him separate from the world, but what he found was the opposite. He was woven into it so completely that there was no boundary left between what he was and what surrounded him. He woke each morning to the same alarm, brewed the same coffee, walked the same streets, but every action felt different, lighter. Life had lost its tension. Before, he had lived in a constant negotiation between who he was and who he thought he should be. Now there was no one to perform for. There was only the doing, the seeing, the being. He noticed small details he had overlooked for years. The way sunlight bent through the blinds, the pattern of steam rising from the cup, the quiet rhythm of his own breathing. The world no longer demanded to be understood, it only asked to be seen. At work, his colleagues sensed something had changed. He still met deadlines, still joined meetings, but the old urgency was gone. He didn't chase approval anymore, and somehow that made him more present. People spoke, and he listened, not waiting to reply, not seeking to impress, just listening. Some found comfort in his calm, others found it unsettling. In a culture addicted to striving, peace can look like indifference, but his peace wasn't apathy, it was clarity. The difference between movement and rushing, between action and escape. He no longer sought grand meaning in things. He understood that meaning had always been an invention of the self, a way to make existence feel manageable. Without that story, everything was stripped bare and yet more beautiful for it. Washing dishes, walking to the store, hearing rain hit the window. These moments, once invisible, had become sacred. They didn't lead anywhere, didn't promise anything, but in their simplicity, he felt closer to truth than he ever had in temples or books. There were still moments of sadness, flashes of old longing, the ache of being human. But even those no longer frightened him. Emotions rose and fell like weather passing through a vast sky. Nothing stayed, and that was no longer a problem. The self that used to cling to happiness and resist pain was gone, leaving behind only awareness, steady, unreactive, tender. He learned to let life move through him without demand or resistance. Freedom, he realized, wasn't the absence of pain, but the absence of ownership over it. Sometimes walking home at dusk, he would catch sight of his reflection in shop windows and smile faintly. The face was familiar, but the story behind it was gone. What remained was presence itself, ordinary, silent, and endlessly alive. He no longer felt the need to prove that he had changed. He simply lived differently, and that was enough. The world had not become more peaceful. It was still full of chaos, noise, and striving. But he had discovered a peace that existed beneath all of it, a peace that didn't depend on circumstances or control. It wasn't a destination he had reached, but a ground he had uncovered beneath every step. He understood now that awakening doesn't end with retreat into silence. It ends with returning to the world unarmed, to work, to love, to speak, to fail, but to do so without illusion. To be fully human, but no longer trapped in the belief that humanity is all there is. Every breath, every ordinary act shimmered with the quiet presence of something vast moving through it. And in that simple living stillness, Alex felt what he had been searching for all along. Not an escape from life, but a reconciliation with it. In the end, what Alex discovered was not a revelation, but a quiet return. He hadn't become enlightened or transcendent. He had simply stopped pretending that life was something to win. What he had lost, the illusions, the masks, the ceaseless striving, had been the architecture of a dream. Without it, the world didn't vanish. It became clearer. The trees looked the same, but he saw the wind moving through them. The city still roared, but its chaos now sounded like music played by something infinite and kind. He realized that awakening was never about arriving somewhere new. It was about remembering what had always been here, patiently waiting beneath the noise, the stillness that existed before he was born, before names, before stories. The same stillness that had been watching through his eyes as a child was watching still, untouched by years or sorrow. Nothing real had ever been lost. What vanished were only the shadows cast by the mind's insistence on control. There was no longer a person who owned this life, only life itself unfolding, speaking, breathing, moving through form. He no longer asked what it all meant, because the question itself belonged to the one who was gone. Meaning had dissolved into being. The beauty was no longer in explanation, but in existence. As he walked home one evening, the city lights flickered like stars. People passed by in their quiet stories, some laughing, some lost, all searching for something they already carried. Alex smiled, not out of certainty but gratitude. The dream had ended, but what remained was vast and unbreakable. It was love, though not the kind that needs to be returned. It was peace, though not the kind that can be kept. It was life as it is, complete, imperfect, eternal. And maybe that's the secret. You don't find what you are, you stop losing it, because what you truly are cannot be taken, cannot be broken, cannot be gone. It's the silence between thoughts, the breath between moments, the space that holds everything. That's what awakened people lose, and what they finally find. If this story touched something in you, let it stay. And if you'd like to explore more journeys like this one, take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who might need it, and subscribe. Not for the numbers, but for the reminder to keep waking up again and again into what was never lost.